The woods behind Pine Ridge, Tennessee, had a way of swallowing sound. Dense canopy filtered the afternoon sun into shafts of amber light that barely reached the forest floor. The air hung thick with humidity, carrying the scent of pine sap and damp earth. Cicadas screamed their relentless summer song, a wall of noise that made thinking difficult and remembering worse. It was the kind of heat that made grown men seek shade and cold beer, the kind that turned even the most energetic children slow and drowsy. But Noah Briggs wasn't looking for shade. He was looking for copper. The beagle had disappeared 3 hours ago, slipping his collar during their morning walk. Noah had searched the usual spots first. The creek bed where Copper liked to chase crawdads. The old Millerson property where rabbits nested in the tall grass. The abandoned tractor behind the Johnson's barn where Copper had once cornered a possum and paid for it with a scratched nose. Nothing. The dog had vanished like morning dew under an unforgiving sun. Noah was small for 8 years old, all knobby knees and sharp elbows, with hair the color of wheat that stuck up in the back no matter how much his grandmother tried to tame it with water and a comb. His t-shirt 2 sizes too big hung off his narrow shoulders, hand-me-down from a cousin he'd never met. Dirt already crusted his sneakers, the knockoff kind from the dollar store with soles that were coming unglued. His face was sun-browned and serious, older than it should have been for a kid who still watched cartoons on Saturday mornings. 3 months. That's how long it had been since his father's funeral. 92 days since Noah had stood in his only pair of dress pants, which were already too short, and watched them lower a flag-draped coffin into red Tennessee clay. 92 days since the rifle salute had cracked across the cemetery like God himself was breaking something precious. 92 days since his grandmother Iris had gripped his hands so tight he thought his bones might snap, her face carved from stone tears, tracking silently down her weathered cheeks. Jake Briggs had been 34 years old, decorated veteran, Purple Heart recipient, unemployed, divorced, addicted to pills that were supposed to help him sleep, but only seemed to help him disappear. The official report said accidental overdose. The whispers around town, the ones that cut off when Noah walked into the general store or the post office, said something different. Said Jake Briggs had finally finished what the war started. Said he'd left his boy behind like unwanted luggage. Noah tried not to think about that, tried not to remember the last words his father had said to him. Take care of your grandmother, okay, buddy? I'm counting on you. Tried not to remember how his dad's hands had shaken when he ruffled Noah's hair. Tried not to remember the hollow look in eyes that used to sparkle when they taught Noah how to fish, how to throw a baseball, how to be brave when the thunder cracked overhead during summer storms. Copper had been his father's dog first, a rescue from the pound, floppy-eared and stubborn, with a nose for trouble and a heart bigger than his barrel chest. Jake had brought him home 2 years before the end, back when there were still good days mixed in with the bad. The beagle had slept at the foot of Noah's bed every night since the funeral, warm and solid proof that something his father had loved was still here, still breathing, still real. Noah couldn't lose him too. The logging trail behind the Briggs property hadn't been used in 15 years, not since the timber company pulled out and left the forest to reclaim what had been taken. Saplings pushed through tire ruts. Vines strangled the remains of a wooden sign that once warned unauthorized vehicles to keep out. The path was barely visible now, more deer track than road, winding deeper into woods that most folks in Pine Ridge avoided. There were stories about these woods, about bootleggers in the 20s who'd buried bodies alongside their moonshine stills, about a girl who'd gone missing in the 50s and was never found, though hunters claimed they sometimes heard her singing at dusk, about teenagers who'd ventured too far and come back different, quieter with shadows in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Noah didn't believe in ghosts. His grandmother said ghosts were just memories that hadn't learned to rest yet, and memories couldn't hurt you unless you let them. But still, as the trail narrowed and the canopy thickened overhead, blocking out more and more of the sun, he felt something press against his chest. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling you got right before a storm when the air turned electric and you knew lightning was coming even though the sky was still blue. He stopped walking, listened. The cicadas had gone quiet. In the sudden silence, Noah could hear his own breathing fast and shallow, could hear his heart beating against his ribs like something trying to get out, could hear the faint rustle of leaves in a breeze he couldn't feel down here in the thick of it. And then underneath it all, he heard something else. A whisper. Broken. Human. Help. The word was so faint Noah almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. But then it came again, a little louder, a little more desperate. A woman's voice cracked and raw, like she'd been screaming until her throat gave out, and this was all that remained. Please, someone. Help. Every instinct Noah possessed screamed at him to run. To turn around and sprint back down that logging trail, back to the safety of the house where his grandmother would be making sweet tea and humming along to gospel radio, back to the world where the worst thing that could happen was another bad dream about his father's funeral. Pine Ridge wasn't the kind of place where strange voices in the woods led to happy endings. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where locked doors and loaded shotguns were sensible precautions, where his grandmother had made him promise never to talk to strangers and especially never to go into the woods alone. But his father had taught him something else, had taught him during their fishing trips, during those long, quiet hours waiting for bass to bite, when Jake Briggs was still mostly himself and the pills hadn't yet built walls between father and son. Bravery isn't about not being scared, Noah. It's about doing what's right even when your knees are shaking and your stomach's in knots. It's about being the kind of person who steps forward when everyone else steps back. Noah's knees were shaking now. His stomach was definitely in knots. But his feet were moving forward, following that broken whisper deeper into the woods, pushing through underbrush that grabbed at his too big t-shirt and left scratches on his arms that he barely felt. The trees opened into a clearing, and Noah's world tilted sideways. A woman was chained to an oak tree. Not tied. Chained. Heavy iron links wrapped around her wrists, secured with a padlock that looked older than Noah, older than his father, maybe older than the tree itself. The metal had bitten into her flesh, leaving raw wounds that wept clear fluid mixed with blood. Her arms were stretched above her head at an angle that made Noah's shoulders ache just looking at it. Her legs had given out at some point. She hung from those chains like a puppet with cut strings, boots dragging in the dirt, barely supporting any of her weight. She wore black leather despite the heat, a vest with patches and pins that meant nothing to Noah over a t-shirt that had once been white but was now stained with dirt and darker things he didn't want to think about. Her jeans were torn at the knees. One boot was missing its laces. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, hung in matted tangles around a face that had seen better days and worse beatings. One eye was swollen completely shut, purple and black and grotesque. The other eye, barely open, was the color of storm clouds. Blood had dried in a trail from her temple, down her cheek like rust-colored tears. Her bottom lip was split wide enough that Noah could see the gap between her teeth when she tried to speak. Bruises decorated her neck in finger-shaped constellations. Someone had hurt her badly. Someone had meant to keep hurting her. And on the back of her vest, even through the grime and blood, Noah could see the patch clear as day. Red and white, wings and skull, letters that spelled out words he'd heard grown-ups whisper with a mixture of fear and fascination. Hell's Angels. Noah had seen those patches before, seen them roaring through Pine Ridge on summer weekends, chrome-flashing engines, thundering loud enough to rattle windows and set off car alarms. The bikers never stopped in town, just blew through like a storm front, heading to rallies in Chattanooga or Memphis or places farther away that Noah only knew from maps. His grandmother always made him come inside when she heard the motorcycles coming. Said those people were trouble, said nothing good came from getting involved with that crowd, said Noah should look away and keep walking if he ever saw them up close. But Noah couldn't look away now. The woman's working eye fixed on him. For a second, neither of them moved. She stared at this skinny 8-year-old boy who'd appeared in her clearing like an answer to a prayer she'd stopped believing in. He stared at this broken woman chained to a tree like something out of a nightmare. Then her eye went wide with what might have been panic. "Kid," her voice was gravel and broken glass. "Run." Noah's feet stayed planted. They might still be close. She tried to lurch forward, but the chains jerked her back against the tree trunk and with a rattling clank that echoed through the clearing. Pain flashed across her ruined face. "Please run. Get out of here before they come back." But Noah's legs felt like they'd grown roots. He stared at the chains, at the blood, at the way she was trembling despite the heat. Something cold settled in his chest, heavy as a stone, but he recognized it now. Not fear of her, fear for her. His backpack slipped off his shoulders without him consciously deciding to take it off. His hands were shaking as he unzipped it, as he pulled out the plastic water bottle he'd filled from the tap that morning. It was lukewarm now, probably tasted like plastic, but it was water, and she looked like she needed it more than oxygen. "You look thirsty," Noah heard himself say. His voice came out steadier than he felt. He took a step forward, then another. Then he was close enough to smell the blood and sweat and fear coming off her in waves. Close enough to see that her eye wasn't just gray. It had flecks of green in it like a lake reflecting summer trees. Close enough to see that underneath all the damage she might have been pretty. Might have smiled a lot back when she had reasons to smile. He twisted the cap off the bottle with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Held it up carefully to her split lips. She flinched at first like she expected him to hit her, and that flinch hurt something deep in Noah's chest. But then she seemed to understand. Seemed to see that he meant help, not harm. Her lips touched the rim of the bottle and she drank careful sips at first, then deeper gulps that made her cough and spray water down her chin. When the bottle was half empty, she pulled back. The chains clinked as she tried to shift position, tried to take some pressure off her wrists, but there was no good way to hang from iron shackles. Pain tightened her face into a mask. "Why are you helping me?" The question came out barely louder than the breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Noah shrugged a gesture his grandmother said made him look like his father when Jake was being stubborn about something. "'Cause you need it. You don't know what you're getting into." She said it gently, like she was trying to warn him without scaring him. "Bad men did this. Men who won't care that you're just a kid." "Did they do that too?" Noah pointed at her wrists where the metal had rubbed the skin raw. "Yeah." Something that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so hollow rattled in her chest. "Bad men who think fear makes them powerful." Noah didn't fully understand what she meant. Didn't understand biker rivalries or territory wars, or the complicated codes of honor and vengeance that govern lives so different from his own small world of school and homework and missing his father. But he understood hurt. Understood what it felt like to be alone and scared and hoping someone would notice. Understood that leaving her here wasn't an option his conscience could live with. "I'm going to get help," he said, and his voice didn't shake this time. "I'll be fast." Her eye widened, being, "No, kid, listen to me. You can't call the cops. If the wrong people find out where I am before my people get here, they'll come back and finish what they started. And they'll hurt anyone who helped me. I can't just leave you here. You have to. Just go home and forget you saw me. I'll be okay." But she wouldn't be okay. Noah could see that clear as day. See it in the way her breathing came too shallow and too fast, in the way her skin had gone pale underneath all the bruising, in the way she was starting to shiver despite the oppressive heat. She was going into shock or something close to it, and Noah didn't need to be a doctor to know that people in shock needed help fast, or they stopped being people who could be helped. "No," he said, and he sounded like his father in that moment, like Jake Briggs when he'd made up his mind about something, and no amount of arguing would change it. "I'm getting help, and if bad men come, they'll have to go through me first." The woman stared at him with her one working eye, and something shifted in that storm gray and green gaze. Something like respect, something like wonder, something that made Noah stand a little straighter, even though his legs still wanted to run. "What's your name, kid?" Noah Briggs." Her eye closed. When she opened it again, it was wet, but not from the sweat rolling down her face. "I'm Savannah Cole, and Noah Briggs, you might just be the bravest person I've ever met." He didn't feel brave. He felt terrified and out of his depth, and like the adults in his life would ground him until he turned 30 when they found out what he'd done. But he also felt like his father was watching from somewhere, nodding approval, and that feeling was worth more than all the fear in the world. Noah turned and ran. The logging trail seemed longer going back. The underbrush grabbed at him with thorny fingers that drew blood he didn't notice. His lungs burned, his leg pumped like pistons. The too big t-shirt flapped around him like broken wings. But he didn't slow down, didn't look back, just focused on the rectangle of light ahead, where the trail opened back into the scrub field behind his house. His hand dove into the pocket of his cargo shorts, fingers closing around the ancient, prepaid flip phone his grandmother insisted he carry. "Just in case," she always said. just in case something happens and you need to call home. She programmed 3 numbers into it. Home, her cell, 911. Noah's thumb found the 9 button, pressed it 3 times as he burst out of the woods and into the killing heat of the open field. The phone was ringing before he'd taken 2 more steps. 911, what's your emergency? The voice was female and professional and calm in a way that made Noah want to scream. But he forced himself to breathe, forced himself to speak clearly, even though his words wanted to tumble over each other in their rush to get out. There's a lady chained to a tree. His voice cracked halfway through. She's bleeding. She can't get loose. She needs help right now. Okay, honey, I need you to stay calm. Where are you? Behind Miller's old logging trail, near the creek bend. In the woods. She's hurt bad, there's blood, and her wrists are all messed up, and she can't stand, and I gave her water, but I don't know what else to do. You did exactly right, sweetheart. Help is on the way. I need you to tell me your name. Noah Briggs. I'm 8. I live on Willow Creek Road. Is the lady conscious? Yeah, but she's shaking, and she told me not to call you, but I had to because she's really hurt. You did the right thing, Noah. I need you to stay on the line with me, okay? Can you go back to where the lady is so you can guide the officers when they arrive? Noah looked back at the dark mouth of the logging trail, looked at the woods that had swallowed Savannah Cole and might swallow him too if those bad men came back. Everything in him wanted to run the other direction, to race home and lock the door and hide under his bed until grown-ups made the scary things go away. But Savannah was alone in those woods, alone and hurt and counting on him even though she'd told him to run. And his father's voice echoed in his head, clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Be the kind of person who steps forward when everyone else steps back. Yeah, Noah said into the phone, I'm going back. He ran into the woods for the 2nd time that day. The dispatcher's voice crackled in his ear, asking questions. He answered on autopilot while his feet found the trail by memory and instinct. How old did the lady look? Hard to tell with all the bruises. Was she wearing anything distinctive? Black leather vest with patches? Did Noah see anyone else in the woods? No, but she said they might come back. The clearing opened before him, and Savannah was still there, still hanging from those chains, but her head had dropped forward, and her one visible eye was closed. And for one horrible second, Noah thought he was too late. Then he saw her chest move. Shallow breaths, but breaths nonetheless. I'm back, he said to the dispatcher, and I'm not leaving her again. He walked across that clearing like he was walking through fire, dropped to his knees next to Savannah Cole and took her hand. Her skin was cold, despite the heat clammy and wrong. But when his small fingers wrapped around hers, her eye cracked open, focused on him, held. Told you to run, she whispered. You were wrong, Noah whispered back. In the distance, growing louder by the second, came the wail of sirens. The sound seemed to take forever to get close, though the dispatcher promised it was only 6 minutes from the first call. 6 minutes that felt like 6 hours, during which Noah held Savannah's hand and talked to her about copper, about his grandmother's sweet tea, about the homework he was supposed to finish before school started next week, about anything and everything except the blood and the chains and the fact that her breathing was getting shallower. When the first deputy burst into the clearing with his hand on his gun, Noah didn't let go of her hand. More deputies poured in behind the first. Then paramedics with a stretcher and bolt cutters that made short work of the ancient padlock. Savannah screamed when they lowered her arms, muscles that had been stretched too long, protesting the change in position. They tried to pry Noah away so they could work, but Savannah wouldn't let go of his hand. The kid stays, she managed through clenched teeth as they started an IV line. He promised. So Noah stayed, held her hand while they cleaned and bandaged her wrists, held her hand while they checked her pupils and blood pressure and the dozen other things paramedics check when someone's been hurt bad, held her hand when they lifted her onto the stretcher and started carrying her back toward the ambulances that couldn't navigate the logging trail. Just before they loaded her into the back of the ambulance, Savannah gripped Noah's wrist with surprising strength, pulled him close, her mouth near his ear. Tell him, she breathed. Tell Mason, a kid didn't run. Then she was gone, doors slamming, sirens screaming, leaving Noah standing in the scrub field with mud on his knees and blood on his hands that wasn't his own. His grandmother arrived 30 seconds later, her old Buick throwing gravel as it skidded to a stop. She pulled Noah into a hug that squeezed the air from his lungs and smelled like flower and lavender in safety. "Oh, baby," she kept saying. "Oh, my baby, what did you do? What did you do?" But the way she held him, the way her hands shook as they ran through his wheat-colored hair, the way she looked at him like she was seeing someone else in his features, told Noah she already knew what he'd done. Told him she was terrified and proud in equal measure. Deputy Walsh wanted to question Noah, but Iris Briggs had other ideas. She planted herself between the deputy and her grandson like a human shield. 5'0" of grandmother turned guardian angel. He's 8 years old and he just found a woman chained in the woods. Questions can wait until he's had a bath and some food and slept in his own bed. "You want to talk to my grandson, you can call tomorrow and we'll make an appointment." Walsh tried to argue. Iris Briggs had raised 2 boys through Vietnam and buried one of them 3 months ago. She didn't budge, didn't blink, didn't give 1 inch of ground until the deputy finally nodded and backed away, hands raised in surrender. She drove Noah home in silence, fed him grilled cheese and tomato soup that he barely tasted, drew him a bath and didn't comment on the scratches or the way his hands shook when he tried to wash Savannah's blood from under his fingernails. Tucked him into bed even though it was barely 6 o'clock and the sun was still hours from setting. Sat on the edge of his mattress and smoothed his hair back from his forehead, the way she'd done when he was small enough to believe monsters couldn't hurt you if someone who loved you was watching. "Your daddy would have done the same thing," she said quietly. "Back before the war changed him. He would have run straight into danger to help someone who needed it. You've got his heart, Noah, the good parts of it." Noah wanted to ask if there were bad parts too, wanted to ask if having his father's heart meant he'd end up like his father, broken and medicated and choosing pills over people. But his grandmother's eyes were already wet and he couldn't bear to make her cry, not tonight. Not when she was looking at him like he was something precious and fragile that might shatter if she held too tight or not tight enough. "You did right, baby," she whispered and kissed his forehead. "You did right." She left the door cracked when she went downstairs. Noah listened to her moving around the kitchen, listened to the 11 o'clock news flickering on the television, listened to her settling into her recliner with the sigh she always made when her knees were bothering her. Normal sounds, safe sounds, the soundtrack of home. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time Noah closed his eyes, he saw Savannah hanging from those chains, saw the fear in her one working eye, heard the rattle of iron links and the desperate whisper of her voice, saw the way she'd flinched when he first approached, like kindness was something she'd learned not to expect. He slipped out of bed, padded downstairs in his bare feet, quiet as a ghost. His grandmother had fallen asleep in her chair, head tilted back, mouth open, snoring softly. The TV flickered blue and silver light across her weathered face. Noah grabbed the remote and turned up the volume just enough to hear. Local news. A perky blonde anchor with too much makeup and not enough warmth in her smile. Breaking news tonight out of Pine Ridge, Tennessee, where authorities are investigating a disturbing discovery in woods behind the old timber mill. A woman whose identity has not been released was found chained to a tree, apparently the victim of assault. She's being treated at Regional Medical Center and is listed in serious but stable condition. The investigation is ongoing. Authorities are asking anyone with information to contact the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department. They cut to footage of the logging trail, yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the evening breeze. An interview with Deputy Walsh, who looked uncomfortable on camera and said nothing useful. No mention of Noah. No mention of the Hells Angels patch. Nothing that explained who Savannah Cole was or why someone had chained her to a tree like an animal. Noah turned off the TV and went back upstairs. Lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the night sounds of rural Tennessee filtered through his window. Crickets and tree frogs. The distant rumble of a train. Copper's soft snoring from his dog bed in the corner, the beagle finally found and returned by a neighbor who'd spotted him digging in her flower bed. Tell Mason a kid didn't run. Noah wondered who Mason was. Wondered if he was looking for Savannah right now. Wondered if Savannah had people who loved her people, who would be sick with worry until they knew she was safe. Wondered what kind of world existed outside Pine Ridge, Tennessee, where women got chained to trees and men wore leather vests with skull patches, and 80-year-old boys had to decide between running and standing their ground. He didn't know it yet, but 3 counties away, in a dimly lit clubhouse that smelled of motor oil and cigarette smoke, a phone was ringing. Didn't know that Mason Cole was about to receive the call that would change everything. Didn't know that right now, this very moment, encrypted messages were lighting up phones across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Alabama. Didn't know that the words, "one of ours," were being passed through a network more efficient than any police scanner, more loyal than blood. Did not know that in basement garages and backyard workshops, in dive bars and roadside motels, men were already throwing legs over motorcycles and kick-starting engines that hadn't cooled from the day's ride. Didn't know that highways were about to fill with leather and chrome, hundreds of bikes converging from every direction like iron moths drawn to a flame. Didn't know that Pine Ridge population 2,847 was about to receive visitors. All Noah knew was that he'd done what his father would have wanted, had stood when he could have run, had helped when he could have walked away. And as exhaustion finally pulled him under, as his eyes drifted closed and sleep claimed him, at last his last conscious thought was simple and clear. I hope she's okay. In the ICU at Regional Medical Center, Savannah Cole lay in a bed that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Her wrists were bandaged thick as boxing gloves. Morphine dripped into her veins, taking the edge off pain that would have made her scream if not for the drugs. But even drugged, even hurting, even terrified that Marcus Kane would find a way to finish what he'd started, she couldn't stop thinking about the kid. 8 years old, no older than her nephew, skinny as a rail fence and half as threatening. But he'd walked toward her when any sane person would have run the other direction. He'd given her water when she was dying of thirst. He'd held her hand while bolt cutters bit through iron. He'd promised not to leave her, and he'd kept that promise, even when keeping it meant ignoring every survival instinct evolution had bred into human beings. The door to her room opened. Mason Cole filled the doorway like a force of nature barely contained by human skin. 6'4" and built like he fought bulls for fun. Tattooed arms that could crush bone, but held her now like she was made of glass. Gray shot through his dark hair and beard, but his eyes were young and fierce and wet. He didn't ask what happened, didn't ask who did it. Just gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of the IV and the bandages and the 100 places where hurt lived under her skin. Just pressed his face into her hair and shook silently, this man who never cried, who prided himself on control, who'd built walls so high around his emotions that even Savannah sometimes forgot he had any. I thought I lost you, he said into her hair, voice breaking on the words. When Kane's message came through when he sent that picture, I thought I was too late. Savannah pulled back enough to look at her husband's face, to see the fear and rage and relief warring in features that could have been carved from granite. To see the man behind the Hells Angels patch the man who'd held her hand during her father's funeral, who'd taught her to ride a Harley, who'd promised to love her until the world ended and maybe a little while after. I'm here because of a kid, she said, 8 years old. Walked straight up to me even though I told him to run. Stayed with me until help came. Held my hand like I wasn't a stranger covered in blood. Mason's jaw worked. Where is he? Home, probably. His name's Noah. Noah Briggs. Something flickered in Mason's eyes. Something that looked like recognition chased by disbelief. Briggs, you know the family. I knew a Jake Briggs, long time ago, but he'd be what, 30-something now. Can't be the same family. Ask around, Savannah said. I want to thank him. Want to make sure he knows what he did mattered. But even as she said it, Savannah felt something shift in the air. Felt the way Mason's expression went still and distant, the way it did when he was putting pieces together that nobody else could see. Felt the wheels turning behind those fierce eyes as connections formed, as past and present collided, as something that should have been impossible started to look inevitable. I'll find him, Mason promised, and I'll make sure he's protected. If Kane knows you survived, if he knows someone helped you, he'll go after them, after the kid. Cold flooded Savannah's chest despite the morphine warmth. No, he's just a child. He can't be part of this. He made himself part of it when he didn't run. Mason kissed her forehead, gentle as a prayer. I've got to make some calls. The brothers need to know you're safe, and we need to talk about what happens next. What happened next began with a phone call, then another, then a dozen, then 100. The network spread like wildfire through dry grass, each call sparking 3 more information passing through channels that law enforcement couldn't tap and wouldn't understand even if they could. Savannah Cole was alive. A kid had saved her. Marcus Kane had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. In clubhouses across 3 states, men who lived by codes older than the law itself began to move. Presidents called their chapters to order. Sergeants at arms checked arsenals and ammunition counts. Road captains plotted routes and rally points. Treasurers emptied cash boxes for gas money and bail money and whatever else might be needed money. But beneath the tactical planning, beneath the talk of retaliation and territory, and sending messages, something else was building. Something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with honor. Because in the world Mason Cole inhabited, debts were sacred. Blood debts, life debts, the kind of debts that demanded payment not in violence but in recognition. An 8-year-old kid had saved one of theirs, had stepped forward when grown men would have stepped back, had shown the kind of courage that Hell's Angels members claim to embody, but rarely witnessed in such pure, uncomplicated form. That kind of courage deserved acknowledgement, deserved respect, deserved something more than a thank you card and a pat on the head. So when Mason Cole sent out the second wave of calls, the message was different. Not a call to arms, a call to witness, a call to honor, a call that said, we ride for Pine Ridge, we ride for the kid who didn't run. And they came. They came from Nashville and Memphis and Birmingham, from Louisville and Lexington and Knoxville, from small towns with names like Hopkinsville and Murfreesboro and Bowling Green. They came alone and in pairs and in packs of 20. They came on Harleys and Hondas and custom choppers worth more than most people's houses. They came with patches that read different chapter names, but all bore the same red and white skull, the same winged emblem that meant family in a language outsiders would never understand. They came because one of their own had been brutalized and left for dead. But more than that, they came because a child had reminded them what they'd sworn to be: protectors, warriors, men who stood between the innocent and the wolves. By dawn on the day after Noah Briggs found Savannah Cole in the woods, the first bikes were already rolling toward Pine Ridge. By mid-morning, the trickle had become a stream. By early afternoon, conservative estimates put the number at over 2,000 riders, with more joining every hour. And Pine Ridge, Tennessee population 2,847 woke up to the sound of distant thunder that wasn't weather. Sheriff Tom Hall was 56 years old and had been in law enforcement for 32 of those years. He'd seen bar fights and domestic disputes, had worked a murder-suicide that still gave him nightmares, had pulled teenagers from mangled cars and told parents their children weren't coming home, had dealt with methamphetamine epidemics and prescription drug abuse, and all the ways people found to hurt themselves and each other in rural America. But he'd never seen anything like what was rolling toward his town. The first call came from a state trooper on Highway 41. "Sheriff, you're going to want to know about this. I've got what looks like a motorcycle convoy, maybe 50 bikes, all heading south toward your county. They're riding legal, staying in formation, but there's a lot of them." Hall thanked the trooper and made a note. 50 bikes, probably just passing through on their way to some rally. Nothing to worry about. The second call came 20 minutes later from a different trooper on Route 127. "Sheriff Hall, we've got another group of motorcycles. Estimate 75 to 80 bikes, also heading toward Cumberland County. You expecting some kind of event?" Hall felt the first tickle of unease in his gut. "Not that I'm aware of. They causing any problems?" "Negative, riding clean, but thought you should know." The third call came from his own deputies stationed at the junction of County Road 18 and Old Mill Road. "Sheriff, I don't know how to tell you this, but I've got visual on at least 100 motorcycles coming from the east. They just keep coming. I can see the line stretching back for miles." Hall stood up from his desk so fast his chair rolled into the wall. "Say again." "Over 100 bikes, sir. Maybe closer to 200 now. All wearing the same colors, Hell's Angels patches. They're headed straight for Pine Ridge." The unease in Hall's gut transformed into ice-cold dread. He grabbed his radio, started calling his deputies in from patrol, started making calls to state police, to the county emergency management office, to anyone who might have intel on why several hundred bikers were converging on his sleepy town. The answer, when it came, made his blood run cold. "They're riding for the Cole woman," a contact with the ATF told him. "The one who got chained up in your woods. She's married to Mason Cole, ranking member of the Tennessee chapter." Word is they're coming to say thanks to whoever saved her. You got a name on the Good Samaritan. Hall's mind raced. The only person who'd been at the scene it was a kid, 8 years old, Noah Briggs. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, Sheriff, I need you to listen very carefully. Mason Cole is old school angels. Code of honor, respect, all that. If they're riding to thank the kid, they're not coming to cause trouble. But you're about to have several thousand bikers in a town that size, and all it takes is one spark to turn a thank you into a riot. You need to prepare for potential civil unrest. By noon, Hall had called in every deputy he had contacted the Tennessee Highway Patrol for backup, had warned the mayor who'd gone pale and started talking about declaring a state of emergency, had called the principal of Pine Ridge Elementary and suggested they send the kids home early just to be safe. By 1 o'clock, the mayor was on TV urging people to stay indoors, lock their doors, remain calm. News vans from Nashville and Chattanooga were already setting up in the town square, drawn by the scent of a story that would lead every broadcast from here to the Georgia state line. By 2 o'clock, Mrs. Dillard at the corner diner was staring out her window at a sight that would be seared into her memory until the day she died. Motorcycles, hundreds of them, thousands, rolling into Pine Ridge like a river of chrome and leather and barely contained power. Not speeding, not revving engines or laying rubber or doing any of the things movies said bikers did when they invaded towns. Just riding slow and steady and disciplined, forming up in the abandoned fairgrounds at the edge of town with military precision. The sound was overwhelming. Not loud in a painful way, but deep, visceral, felt more than heard. The combined rumble of 3,000 engines resonated in chest cavities and window panes. It made the ground tremble, made the air itself seem to vibrate. It was the sound of controlled power of strength held deliberately in check of men who could cause chaos but were choosing not to. They parked in rows, perfect lines, bikes gleaming under the afternoon sun. When the engines cut, the silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the noise had been. 3,000 men dismounting, 3,000 helmets coming off, 3,000 sets of eyes turning toward the front of the formation where Mason Cole stood next to his wife. Savannah had checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice. Her wrists were still bandaged. Her face was still bruised. One arm hung in a sling, but she stood upright and unbroken beside her husband, living proof that whatever Marcus Kane had tried to do to her had failed. Sheriff Hall approached with a half-dozen deputies flanking him, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Hall's hand rested on his gun, not threatening, but not relaxed either. Behind the police line, news cameras rolled. Helicopters circled overhead. Social media was already exploding with videos and photos and wild speculation. Mason stepped forward before the sheriff could speak. His voice carried without shouting, trained by years of making himself heard over engine noise and bar crowds. Sheriff Hall, this is a peaceful assembly. We're here for one reason only. A boy in this town showed more courage than most grown men ever will. We're here to say thank you. Hall studied Mason's face, looked past him at the sea of leather-clad bikers, at patches that told stories of chapters, and ranks at faces that ranged from barely legal to weathered and gray. Look for weapons, for hostility, for any sign that this was about to turn into the nightmare scenario every law enforcement agency had wargamed. What he saw instead was restraint, order, men who'd ridden hundreds of miles not to start trouble, but to witness something, to be part of something, to pay respects in the only way they knew how. You're talking about Noah Briggs, Hall said. If that's the kid who found my wife and didn't run, then yeah, that's who we're here for. He's 8 years old enough to be brave when it counted. Hall's jaw worked. He was outgunned, outmanned, and out of options. He could try to disperse them, but on what grounds? They weren't breaking any laws. Could try to arrest them, but for what? Parking in formation. He looked at the crowd of bikers, saw the discipline in their ranks, saw that they were waiting for his response, and made a judgment call that would either save his town or doom it. You hurt anyone in my town, you'll answer to me, Hall said. You destroy property, you'll be arrested. You disrespect the people who live here, you'll leave in handcuffs. Are we clear? Mason extended his hand. Crystal, Sheriff, you have got my word. We respect the town, we respect the law, and we respect the kid. They shook. The deputies looked like they wanted to object, but Hall was already turning back toward his patrol car, already radioing his people to stand down but stay alert, already accepting that his quiet little town was about to have a day it would never forget. At the Briggs farmhouse on Willow Creek Road, Iris was making lunch when she heard it. That rumble. That deep bass note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She went to the window, pushed aside the gingham curtains, and felt her heart stop. Motorcycles, more motorcycles than she'd seen in her entire life. The fairgrounds were visible from here, a half-mile distant, and it looked like someone had parked a small city's worth of bikes in the field where they used to hold the county fair. Even from this distance, she could see the riders milling around, could see more bikes still arriving, could see that this was something bigger than she had words for. Noah was in the living room, supposedly doing the summer reading his teacher had assigned. But when Iris looked at him, he was standing at the window, small face pressed against the glass, eyes wide as dinner plates. "Grandma," he said quietly, "that's a lot of motorcycles. Come away from the window, baby. Are they here because of the lady I found?" Iris didn't answer, couldn't answer, because she didn't know, and that not knowing made her want to grab Noah and run to pack a bag and get in the car and drive until Tennessee was a memory and Pine Ridge was just a dot on a map they'd never visit again. But running was how you taught children to be cowards, and whatever else Jake Briggs had been, he hadn't raised a coward. The knock came at 8:03 in the morning on the second day. Iris had spent a sleepless night with the shotgun across her lap and 911 pre-dialed on her phone. But morning had come peaceful, and the news reports all said the same thing: the bikers weren't causing trouble. We're actually helping, fixing things, donating money, being so aggressively well-behaved that nobody knew quite what to make of it. Still, when the knock echoed through her quiet house, Iris's finger went to the trigger before her rational mind could stop her instinct. She set the gun down, walked to the door, looked through the peephole at a sight that would have been funny if it wasn't terrifying. 4 men stood on her porch. Big men, tattooed men, men wearing leather vests with patches that proclaimed them Hell's Angels in letters big enough to read from space. But they'd removed their sunglasses, stood with hands visible and empty, posture respectful, almost military in its formality. The one in front was the biggest, gray in his beard, eyes that had seen things Iris could only imagine. He looked at the peephole like he knew she was watching, waited with the patience of someone who understood that fear took time to process. Noah appeared at Iris's elbow. "Is that them? Go to your room." "But Grandma," "Noah Alexander Briggs, go to your room right now." But Noah didn't move, just stood there with that stubborn set to his jaw that was pure Jake, pure Briggs, bloodline refusal to back down when they'd made up their mind about something. "I want to see them." Iris looked at her grandson, at this child who'd been through too much in 8 short years, who'd lost his father and found his courage in the same terrible summer, who'd done what grown men failed to do and somehow survived to tell about it. And she realized with a clarity that hurt that she couldn't protect him forever, couldn't wrap him in cotton wool and keep him safe from a world that didn't care if you were 8 or 80, that would break you if it could and test you even if it couldn't. "Stay behind me," she said, "and if I tell you to run, you run. Understand?" Noah nodded. Iris opened the door. Mason Cole looked down at the elderly woman with the spine of steel and the protective fury radiating off her like heat shimmer from summer asphalt. Looked past her at the kid, small for 8, wheat-colored hair, eyes that were too old for his face, wearing an oversized t-shirt and shorts barefoot on hardwood floors, looking up at Mason without fear. Looking up at Mason with Jake Briggs' eyes. The resemblance hit Mason like a fist to the solar plexus. The shape of the face, the set of the shoulders, the way he stood his ground, that even though he was maybe 70 pounds soaking wet and facing down men who could break him without trying. This wasn't just any kid who'd saved Savannah. This was Jake's kid. Had to be. The universe didn't do coincidences this cruel. Mason lowered himself to one knee, putting himself at Noah's eye level. Behind him, the other bikers did the same, a show of respect that made Iris's grip on the doorframe tighten. "You're the one who didn't run," Mason said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Noah shrugged. She was thirsty. Something that might have been a laugh caught in Mason's throat. "My wife is alive because of you. Do you understand that if you'd run, if you'd kept walking, she'd be dead in those woods right now? I couldn't leave her. Why not? Because she was scared and hurt and alone. Noah said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, like there was no other possible answer. Like kindness was just what you did, and the consequences of that kindness didn't matter as much as the doing. Mason felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen since Jake Briggs had chosen pills over phone calls, isolation over intervention, death over asking for help. He'd failed Jake, had tried to reach out, tried to pull his old friend back from the edge, but Jake had pushed everyone away with both hands and jumped anyway. But Jake's kid was here, standing in front of Mason with bare feet and too big clothes and eyes that said he'd already learned the hardest lesson life could teach, that sometimes doing right hurt worse than doing wrong, but you did it anyway because the alternative was becoming someone you couldn't live with. Mason reached into his saddlebag, pulled out something he'd had made in the 12 hours between learning who Noah was and showing up on this porch. A vest, child-sized, black leather, soft as butter, and on the back embroidered in thread that would outlast them all a patch unlike any other in Hell's Angels history. Honorary guardian, courage before fear. In our world, Mason said carefully, when someone risks themselves for one of ours, we don't forget it. You did something that means something. This vest, it's not official colors. It's not asking you to join anything or be anything except what you already are. It's just our way of saying we see you. We see what you did, and we'll remember. He held it out. Noah looked at his grandmother for permission. Iris's eyes were wet, but she nodded just once, and maybe she saw what Mason saw, that this wasn't recruitment or corruption or any of the terrible things she'd feared when she heard the motorcycles coming. This was just broken men recognizing courage in its purest form and trying to honor it the only way they knew how. Noah took the vest. It hung big on his narrow shoulders, but somehow it looked exactly right. Like he'd grown into it before he'd even put it on. Like it fit not his body but something deeper. Mason stood, turned toward the road where 3,000 riders had gathered in silent formation waiting for his signal. He lifted his hand once. 3,000 engines roared to life in perfect unison, a sound that shook windows and rattled in Iris's bones. Then just as quickly they cut. Silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Mason handed Noah a microphone. Say what you want to say. Noah stared at the ocean of leather and chrome, at men who'd ridden hundreds of miles because he'd done the right thing, at a crowd bigger than every person he had ever met combined. He should have been terrified, should have been tongue-tied and small. But standing there in his oversized vest with his grandmother's hand on his shoulder, he felt something else. He felt like his father was watching, like Jake Briggs was somewhere in the vast mystery beyond death, looking down at his son and nodding approval. And that feeling gave Noah strength he didn't know he possessed. My grandma says being brave means helping even when you're scared. His voice was small but clear, carrying through the microphone to speakers someone had set up. So if you came here because you think I was brave, then you have to be brave too. Don't scare my town. The silence that followed was deeper than anything Pine Ridge had ever known. 3,000 men, some of whom had been riding motorcycles since before Noah's parents were born, stood witnessing an 8-year-old child hold them accountable. Hold them to their own code. Remind them what they'd come here to represent. Then Mason spoke, voice carrying across the assembled riders, without electronic help, because he'd spent decades making himself heard. You heard him. What happened next rewrote every assumption Pine Ridge had about bikers and trouble and the nature of fear itself. Instead of revving engines and terrorizing streets, the Hells Angels dispersed in controlled groups with one mission: help. They filled gas tanks at the station and tipped $50 on $15 fill-ups. They packed Mrs. Dillard's diner until people were standing in the parking lot, and they left $100 bills under plates that barely totaled 20. They found the broken fence at the elementary school playground, the one that had been broken for 3 years, while the county argued about budget allocation, and they fixed it in 90 minutes with materials they drove to the next town to buy. The mechanic shop got overwhelmed when a dozen bikers showed up and asked if there was any work that needed doing. They rotated tires, changed oil, replaced brake pads, all free of charge, all with a precision that spoke to decades of working on engines. They found Sheriff Hall's aging patrol car and rebuilt the transmission while he sputtered protests that died when he realized they weren't taking no for an answer. By noon, the fairgrounds looked less like a biker rally and more like a festival. Children who'd been kept inside by nervous parents started appearing on the edges, drawn by curiosity that overrode caution. The bikers let them sit on stationary motorcycles, explained how engines worked with a patience that surprised everyone except the bikers themselves, who knew that rough exteriors often hid soft centers. Savannah moved through the crowd, still bruised, still bandaged, but smiling in a way that transformed her battered face into something beautiful. She found mothers who'd been terrified that morning and told them stories about her own kids back in Memphis waiting for her to come home. Found old men who'd served in Vietnam and talked bikes and shared memories of a world that didn't make sense to people who hadn't lived through it. Found frightened people and made them less frightened just by being human, by being real, by being more than the patches on her vest. Someone set up a collection jar at the entrance to the fairgrounds. Just a big glass jar with a handwritten sign for Pine Ridge. For the kids. Within an hour, the jar was full. Within 2 hours, they'd replaced it with a lockbox. Within 4 hours, they'd replaced the lockbox with a duffel bag that clinked with the weight of Bashan coins and the occasional piece of jewelry that someone thought might be worth something. The total, when they counted it later, would be $83,427. Enough to rebuild the playground, enough to buy new computers for the school, enough to fund a scholarship in Jake Briggs' name, though Noah wouldn't learn about that until the letters arrived offering to help with college 12 years in the future. But more than money, the day brought something Pine Ridge hadn't had in a long time: hope. The kind of hope that comes from watching rough men be gentle, from seeing that scary people could choose not to be scary, from learning that your assumptions about the world might be wrong in the best possible way. Noah spent the day in a daze. People kept stopping him, shaking his hand, telling him he was brave. Photographers took his picture until Iris finally put her foot down and said enough. News crews tried to interview him, but Mason's people formed a human wall that no amount of press credentials could penetrate. Someone gave Noah a handful of patches, souvenirs from chapters across 3 states, and he held them like they were made of gold. By sunset, the fairgrounds had transformed. What could have been a riot had become a community gathering. People from Pine Ridge mixing with bikers, finding common ground and shared humanity. Fear giving way to curiosity, giving way to something that might in time turn into understanding. But as the light faded and the engines prepared to roll out, Mason's expression remained watchful, because he knew something the town didn't. Knew that Marcus Kane was still out there. Knew that the Black Vipers wouldn't forgive this public humiliation. Knew that kindness and charity wouldn't stop men who dealt in fear and violence. Knew that the price for this perfect day would come due. The attack came at 3:42 in the afternoon on the 3rd day, just as Mason was preparing to signal the final departure. The bikers had stayed an extra day at the request of the mayor, who'd gone from terrified to grateful to genuinely sad to see them leave. They'd done more good in 72 hours than the state government had managed in 3 years. Fixed things, built things, connected with people, proved that patches and leather didn't define character. But Marcus Kane had been watching, had seen the news coverage, the viral videos, the image of his old friend Mason Cole kneeling before a child while thousands of angels stood witness. Had seen it and felt something toxic boil in his chest. Rage at being shown up. Fury at having his message of fear answered with a message of hope. Hatred for Mason, for Savannah, for every person who'd chosen light over the darkness Kane had made his home. The first shot came from the tree line beyond the eastern fence. A sharp crack that echoed across the fairgrounds like a branch breaking, except branches didn't make people's heads snap around in recognition and fear. The second shot followed a heartbeat later, close enough that the people who'd grown up around hunting rifles could tell these weren't hunting rifles. These were made for killing people, not deer. The plank of wood behind the donation table exploded into splinters. Someone screamed. Then everyone was screaming, but the screams were drowned out by a sound that would echo in nightmares for years to come. Mason Cole's voice, trained by decades of making himself heard over chaos, thundering one word across the fairgrounds. Down. 3,000 people dropped. Bikers hit the dirt with practiced efficiency, bodies covering civilians before conscious thought could complete the order. Mothers found themselves shielded by men whose names they didn't know. Children disappeared under leather-clad backs. Old men who'd survived one war found themselves protected by men who'd survived different wars. Savannah moved on pure instinct. She saw Noah standing frozen 20 feet away, saw the confusion and fear on his small face, saw him trying to understand why the perfect day had suddenly turned nightmare. She crossed that distance in 4 strides, grabbed Noah, pulled him down behind the steel frame of a parked motorcycle. Her body curved over his like a shield made of flesh and bone, and determination that nothing would hurt this kid, not while she had breath left to stop it. "Stay still," she whispered in his ear. "Just stay still and quiet, and it'll be over soon." But Noah could feel her shaking, could feel the way her heart hammered against his back, could hear the shots still ringing out, could hear the shouted orders and the screams and the sound of motorcycles being dragged into makeshift barricades, could smell gun smoke and fear and the copper tang of blood on the wind. From the tree line, 3 motorcycles burst forward, black paint, unfamiliar patches, vipers coiled and ready to strike. The riders wore masks, faces hidden behind skull bandanas, but their intent was clear in every line of their bodies, in every rev of their engines, in the guns they'd slung across their backs before mounting up. Marcus Kane's plan was simple: chaos, terror, proof that Mason's message of peace was a lie, that violence always won in the end, that the Hells Angels were soft and weak and deserved to be crushed. He'd counted on panic, on people stampeding, on the perfect day dissolving into perfect destruction that would dominate news cycles and rewrite the narrative. What he hadn't counted on was discipline. The Hells Angels didn't charge forward in rage, didn't fire blindly into the woods, didn't put civilians at risk to chase down revenge. They moved with the coordination of men who'd trained for exactly this scenario, who'd served in armed forces before they'd ever patched into the club, who knew that the difference between warriors and killers was control. Veterans flanked left using parked bikes as cover, moving in paired teams that would have made drill sergeants proud. Others ushered civilians toward the concrete livestock building at the edge of the fairgrounds, bodies forming a corridor that bullets would have to go through them to reach. Not a single rider drew a gun from the crowd. Not a single shot was fired blindly into the tree line where the shooters hid. Sheriff Hall was screaming into his radio, calling for every available unit for state police, for anyone with a badge and a gun, to converge on his town right now. Deputies were already moving, weapons drawn, taking up positions that complemented rather than competed with the bikers' defensive formation. The 3 Black Vipers riders realized too late that their attack had failed before it started. Realized that chaos wasn't spreading, that people weren't dying, that their presence was doing nothing except marking them as targets. They tried to retreat, engines screaming, but the eastern fence was already blocked by bikers who'd circled around through the woods, by men who knew this kind of ambush only worked if you controlled all the exits. 2 of the Vipers went down hard when their bikes hit a drainage ditch hidden in tall grass. Bodies flying, motorcycles tumbling, the sick crunch of bone meeting earth at speed. They tried to run on foot, but Hells Angels veterans tackled them with textbook precision, held them down without beating them, without breaking bones, just immobilizing threats until law enforcement could take over. The 3rd Viper rider made it farther, almost to the tree line, almost to the vehicle Kane had stashed for exactly this kind of emergency escape. But a 42-year-old accountant named David Chen, who rode with the Louisville chapter on weekends and had never thrown a punch in his life, put his bike directly in the path. The Viper had to choose: hit the bike or swerve. He swerved, right into the ditch, right into the waiting arms of 3 deputies who'd positioned themselves perfectly. 11 minutes after the first shot, it was over. Sirens wailed from every direction. State police cars poured into the fairgrounds from 3 different access roads. Ambulances followed medics ready for mass casualties that didn't materialize. Because while 17 Hells Angels members had been injured, shot, or grazed, or hurt in the case of taking cover and protecting others, not one civilian had a scratch. Not one child had been harmed. Not one member of the Pine Ridge community had bled because bikers had made themselves walls between bullets and innocence. Noah emerged from behind the motorcycle on shaking legs. Savannah let him go reluctantly, her hands the last thing to leave him, like she was afraid that releasing contact meant releasing responsibility. Noah's vest was dusty but intact. His face was pale, but his eyes were dry. He looked around at the organized chaos, at injured men being treated by the very people they'd protected at Sheriff Hall, coordinating with Mason Cole, like they'd been partners for years instead of meeting 3 days ago. and Noah walked toward one of the injured bikers. Bear Thompson sat on the ground with his back against a motorcycle tire, one massive hand pressed to his shoulder where a bullet had torn through muscle and kept going. His face was gray with pain, but he waved off the medic trying to treat him. "Check the kid first. Make sure the kid's okay." "I'm okay, Tease," Noah said quietly. Bear looked at him, really looked with eyes that had seen Fallujah and Kandahar, eyes that had watched friends die and enemies fall, eyes that had forgotten how to be gentle until this moment. "You sure, little man? You got shot protecting Mrs. Dillard's grandson." Noah had watched it happen, had seen Bear throw himself over a 5-year-old boy when the shooting started, had seen the impact spin Bear half around but not knock him down, had seen him stay covering that child until all clear was called. "Why'd you do that?" "Because he's 5 and I'm 47. Because I've had my life and he's barely started his. Because that's what you do." Bear managed something that might have been a smile if pain wasn't making his face into a mask. "Same reason you stayed with Savannah when you could have run. We don't leave people behind." Noah looked at the blood seeping between Bear's fingers, looked at the medic hovering with gauze and antiseptic, looked at all the other injured men being treated by townspeople who'd been afraid of them 72 hours ago. And something shifted in his understanding of the world. These men weren't heroes in the cartoon sense, perfect and untouchable. They were flawed and rough and probably broken in ways Noah was too young to understand. But they'd stood between harm and innocence, had taken bullets meant for strangers, had honored their code in a way that transcended patches and bikes and all the surface things people used to judge them. "Thank you," Noah whispered. "Thank your grandma for raising you right," Bear said. "And thank your daddy wherever he is. He made you brave." Savannah appeared at Noah's shoulder. Her sling was gone, ripped off at some point during the chaos. Her rebandaged wrists were already seeping blood from exertion. But she was upright and fierce and alive. She put her hand on Noah's head, gentle as a benediction. "You okay, honey?" Noah nodded. "They got hurt because of me." "No," Mason's voice from behind them. "They got hurt because evil men made evil choices. But they're alive because good men made good choices. You showed us how. You were the first. We just followed." Cameras captured it all. The bikers being treated by the people they protected. Sheriff Hall shaking Mason's hand while deputies arrested the Black Vipers. Savannah with her arm around Noah, fierce mother, protecting fierce child. The banner someone had hung across the town hall bullet hole stitched through fabric, but the message still clear: Pine Ridge stands together. By evening, the news had gone national. Not because of the attack, because of the response. Because in an age where division seemed to be the only constant, where fear drove more clicks than hope, where violence begat violence in an endless cycle, Pine Ridge had broken the pattern. Rough men with scary patches had become heroes. A terrified town had become grateful. An 8-year-old child had become the still point around which everything else revolved, the quiet center that held when Case tried to tear things apart. The bikers left the next morning. Not in one massive formation, but in staggered groups like a long goodbye instead of a quick rip. Each group stopped by the Briggs farmhouse. Each rider who'd been injured made sure to wave to Noah to show him they were okay, to prove that protection came with costs, but those costs were worth paying. Mason was the last to leave. He pulled Noah aside, away from cameras and crowds, away from his grandmother's watchful eye. Knelt so they were eye to eye the way he had that first morning. "Your daddy was my friend," Mason said. "Long time ago, before you were born, we served together in a way, watched each other's backs." Noah's throat went tight. "You knew my dad. Knew him when he was young and full of fire. Before the war took pieces he couldn't get back." Mason pulled something from his pocket. Dog tags, old ones, Jake Briggs's name stamped in metal. "He gave me these the last time I saw him. Said if anything happened, I should give them to his kid someday. Tell that kid that Jake Briggs was brave once, that the sickness that took him didn't erase all the good he'd done." Tears burned Noah's eyes. "He killed himself." "I know, and that doesn't make him a coward. It makes him someone who hurt so bad he couldn't see any other way out. Mental pain is real pain, Noah. Your daddy fought a war most people couldn't understand, and when he came home, the war came with him. He lost that fight. But that doesn't mean he didn't try. Doesn't mean he wasn't brave in all the ways that counted before the end. Mason pressed the dog tags into Noah's hand. You keep these. And when you're old enough to understand, you read about PTSD and veteran suicide and all the ways this country fails the people it sends to fight. You learn that your daddy was a casualty of war just as much as any soldier who died on a battlefield. And you know that he loved you. That leaving you behind broke something in him that was already cracked, and he just couldn't find the glue to fix it. Did you try to help him? Every way I knew how. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes people need professional help, and they're too proud or too scared or too broken to ask for it. Sometimes the best thing you can do is survive them and remember them whole. Noah clutched the dog tag so hard the metal bit into his palm. I don't want to forget him. You won't. You carry him in your bones and your blood, in the way you stood when you could have run. That's his legacy, Noah. Not the end. The way he raised you before the pain got too big. Mason stood, extended his hand for a shake man to man, equal to equal. Noah took it, felt the calluses and scars, felt the strength held carefully in check. You ever need anything, Mason said, you call. I put my number in your grandma's phone. I don't care if it's tomorrow or 20 years from now. You call and I come. That's the debt I owed your daddy. That's the debt you're owed for saving Savannah. Debts like that don't expire. Then he was gone, motorcycle rumbling to life, chrome catching morning sun, leather creaking as he settled into the worn saddle. He didn't look back, just lifted one hand in acknowledgement and rode out of the fairgrounds, out of Pine Ridge, out of Noah's daily life, but never out of the story, never out of the constellation of people who'd shaped this impossible 72 hours. The town was quiet after they left, not the fearful quiet of before when people locked doors against imagined threats. A different quiet, the kind that settles after something profound has happened and everyone needs time to process, to understand, to figure out what comes next. The mayor announced the formation of a committee to distribute the donated money. The school board fast-tracked plans for the new playground. Mrs. Dillard started a tradition of leaving one table in her diner marked reserved for riders, though months would pass before any Hells Angels returned to claim it. Sheriff Hall wrote a commendation for every deputy who'd worked the 3 days, then surprised everyone by writing one for Mason Cole. 2 submitted to some database, Hall wouldn't explain, but that made the dispatcher smile when she filed it. And Noah went back to being 8 years old. Except he wasn't, not really. You can't carry a woman's hope in your hands and stay unchanged. Can't watch men take bullets for strangers and maintain the same worldview. Can't stand at the center of something bigger than yourself and remain small. School started 2 weeks later. Tucker Hall, the sheriff's son, who'd made Noah's life miserable since kindergarten, approached Noah at recess. Noah braced for the usual taunts, the usual shoves, the usual reminders that he didn't have a father, and that made him less than. But Tucker just stood there, scuffing his sneaker in the dirt, looking uncomfortable and young and unsure. My dad said you saved that lady, Tucker said finally. Said you were braver than most adults he knows. Noah didn't know what to say to that. I'm sorry, Tucker continued, words coming fast like he'd practiced them. About your dad, about being mean, about everything. He stuck out his hand, awkward and earnest. Can we start over? Noah looked at that extended hand, thought about his father who'd taught him that courage was doing what's right even when it hurt. Thought about Mason, who'd shown him that debts and honor mattered more than pride. Thought about 3,000 bikers who'd ridden for hundreds of miles just to thank a kid for being kind. He took Tucker's hand. Yeah, we can start over. The weeks became months. Summer gave way to fall, fall to winter. The playground was rebuilt with bright new equipment and a plaque that thanked the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club for their donation. The school got computers that actually worked. A scholarship fund was established in Jake Briggs' name, managed by a board that included Iris Briggs and surprisingly Mason Cole, who appeared by video conference for every meeting. And Noah grew, not just physically, though he did that too, shooting up 3 inches that year, like his body was trying to catch up to his spirit. But he grew in confidence, in understanding, in the quiet knowledge that he'd done something that mattered, and that mattering wasn't about size or age or how many people knew your name. He started volunteering at the animal shelter, drawn to the rescue dogs that reminded him of Copper. Started tutoring younger kids who struggled with reading patient in a way that surprised his teachers. Started standing up when he saw injustice, whether that was a kid being bullied, or a classmate being excluded, or someone in need being ignored. His grandmother watched it all with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. Pride because her grandson was becoming the kind of man Jake Briggs had been before the war broke him. Heartbreak because she knew that kindness carried a cost, that standing for others meant you became a target, that the world wasn't always kind to kind people. But she didn't stop him, couldn't stop him, because she'd learned watching 3,000 bikers descend on Pine Ridge that sometimes the people you feared were the ones who taught you the most important lessons. That rough exteriors often hid soft hearts. That judgment was a luxury and understanding was a necessity. 6 months after the bikers left, a package arrived at the Briggs farmhouse. No return address. Inside, wrapped in careful layers of bubble wrap, was a photograph. 3,000 bikers at the fairgrounds, arranged in formation, and right in the center, kneeling with his hand on Noah's shoulder, was Mason Cole. Someone had printed it, poster-sized, had it professionally framed, had added a placard at the bottom with a single line of text. "Courage isn't loud. It stands still when others run." Noah hung it in his room next to his father's dress uniform that Iris had finally felt strong enough to unpack from the closet. The honorary vest hung there, too still, too big, but Noah tried it on sometimes. Looked at himself in the mirror and tried to see what Mason and Savannah and 3,000 bikers had seen in a scared 8-year-old who'd given water to a stranger. Winter deepened. Pine Ridge settled back into routine. The news vans left. The viral videos stopped being shared. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it ever got in small-town Tennessee. But on a cold February morning when ice crusted the windows and breath fogged in the air, Noah saw something that made his heart stop. A man, standing across the street from the school, watching. He was too far away for Noah to see his face clearly, but something about his posture, about the way he held himself apart from the normal flow of parents dropping off kids, set off alarm bells. Noah looked away, looked back. The man was still there, and he was staring directly at Noah. The school day passed in a blur. Noah couldn't focus on his math worksheet, couldn't pay attention to the book his teacher read aloud, kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that figure standing there watching, waiting. When the final bell rang, Noah deliberately left with a group of other kids. Safety in numbers. The stranger was gone. Noah told himself he'd imagined the whole thing, that his mind was playing tricks, that the events of summer had made him paranoid. But the next day, the man was back. Different location, same watchful intensity. And the day after that, always keeping his distance, always just watching. Never approaching, never threatening, but present in a way that felt wrong. On the 4th day, Noah told his grandmother. Iris went pale, then red, then picked up the phone and called Sheriff Hall. Hall took it seriously, drove by the school during pickup, but saw nothing suspicious. Promised to increase patrols. Told Noah he'd probably just noticed someone who'd always been there, that the mind did funny things after trauma. But Noah knew the way you know things in your bones before your brain catches up. Someone was watching him, someone who hadn't been there before, someone connected to everything that had happened, someone dangerous. That night, lying in bed with copper warm against his side, Noah did something he hadn't done since the attacks. He called the number Mason had programmed into his grandmother's phone. Let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Started to hang up because it was stupid, because Mason was probably busy, because 8-year-olds didn't call biker leaders at 9 o'clock on school nights. Then Mason answered. Noah, his voice was sharp with instant concern. What's wrong? There's a man watching me. At school. He's been there 4 days in a row. I think he's looking for you, or for Savannah. I think he's from before. The silence on the other end stretched so long Noah thought the call had dropped. Then Mason spoke, and his voice was different now. Harder, colder. The voice of someone making plans that wouldn't appear in any police report. Does your grandma know? Yeah, she called the sheriff. Good. That's good. Listen to me very carefully, Noah. Tomorrow you stay home from school. Tell your grandma you're sick. Don't argue, just do it. I'm coming to Pine Ridge. I'll be there by noon. Is it him? Is it Marcus Kane? Another pause. Kane's in federal custody. Has been since the arrests. This is someone else. Someone we missed. But Noah, I need you to trust me. Need you to know that whoever's watching you won't get close. I promise you that. You save Savannah. That makes you family. And we protect family. Noah wanted to feel reassured, wanted to believe that Mason's promise meant safety, but he'd learned enough about the world to know that promises and protection weren't the same thing. That sometimes bad men won despite the good men's best efforts. That his father had loved him and still chosen to leave. I'm scared, Noah admitted. Good, fear keeps you smart. But Noah, you stood in front of a chained woman and gave her water when you could have run. You've got more courage than most men 3 times your age. You hold on to that, hold on to it, and don't let go. Mason arrived at 11:47 the next morning, not alone but with 5 other bikers who moved like they'd trained for this. They swept the property, checked the woods, examined the road for surveillance. Found nothing concrete, but their expressions said they'd found enough. Marcus Kane's cousin, a man named Reese who'd been spotted asking questions in town about the kid who played hero, who'd been asking about Noah's school schedule, about whether his grandmother worked, about security at the Briggs farmhouse, asking the kind of questions that made Mason's jaw clench and his hands curl into fists. They set up a rotation. 2 bikers stayed at the Briggs house at all times, sleeping in shifts, maintaining watch. Others positioned themselves at the school, looking like parents or maintenance workers, or anything except what they were, trained soldiers executing a protection detail. Sheriff Hall coordinated with Mason, and if he had official objections to civilians running security, he kept them to himself. Because Hall had learned what Noah learned, that sometimes the people outside the system were better equipped to handle threats the system couldn't process. 3 days of waiting, 3 days of Noah going to school with escorts, 3 days of Iris barely sleeping, shotgun loaded and leaning against her bedroom door. 3 days of tension stretched so tight it felt like the air itself might snap. On the 4th day, Reese made his move. He'd been patient, had scoped the security, mapped the patterns, found what he thought was a weakness. The brief window between when Noah's bus dropped him off and when he made it to the front door, that 50-yard stretch where he was technically unprotected. Reese had a van, had practiced the snatch, had convinced himself that grabbing the kid would give him leverage over Mason, over the whole Hells Angels organization that had humiliated his family. What Reese didn't know was that the security was designed to look weak exactly there. That every day Noah had walked that path with invisible protection, bracketing him from 3 different angles. That the moment Reese's van pulled up to the curb and the side door slid open, he'd already lost. Mason stepped out from behind Iris's Buick, not rushing, not shouting, just moving with the kind of purposeful calm that was more terrifying than rage. Behind him, Bear Thompson emerged from the tool shed, moving despite the shoulder that still ached from the bullet. From the woods came 2 more bikers, cutting off the retreat. Reese froze, hand on the van door, eyes wide with the sudden understanding that he'd walked into a trap. "Step away from the vehicle," Mason said. Not loud, didn't need to be. Hands where I can see them. For a second, it could have gone either way. Reese could have run, could have fought, could have made 1,000 stupid choices that would have ended with him in a hospital or a morgue. But he saw something in Mason's eyes. Something that said violence was on the table, but a restraint was being chosen, and that choice could evaporate faster than summer rain on hot asphalt. Reese put his hands up, stepped away from the van. Sheriff Hall's cruiser pulled up 30 seconds later. Lights flashing. Hall didn't ask questions, just cuffing. Reese read him his rights, loaded him into the back of the car, looked at Mason with an expression that might have been gratitude or might have been respect or might have been both. "We'll handle it from here," Hall said. Mason nodded. "Appreciate it, Sheriff." Then Hall looked at Noah, who'd watched the whole thing from the safety of his grandmother's porch. "You okay, son?" Noah nodded. "I'm okay." But he wasn't. Not really, because he just learned a lesson he wished he didn't need to learn, that doing good made you a target. That standing up for others meant others might try to tear you down. That courage came with consequences that lasted longer than the moment. After the sheriff left, after Reese was processed and charged and shipped off to a cell that would hold him for a long time, Mason sat with Noah on the porch steps. Iris was inside making coffee, giving them space, understanding that some conversations needed to happen between the men who'd fought the battle regardless of age. "I'm sorry," Mason said. "You did one good thing and it followed you for months. That's not fair. That's not right." You caught him, though. Noah's voice was smaller than it had been. Tired. He won't hurt anyone now. No, he won't. But Noah, I need you to understand something. The world isn't fair. People who do right don't always get rewarded. Sometimes they get tested. Sometimes they get targeted. Sometimes being good means signing up for a harder path than being selfish. Then why do it? The question came out raw. Why be good if it just makes you a target? Mason was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience of years spent navigating a world that didn't fit in simple categories of right and wrong. Because targets heal, regret doesn't. You can patch up a wound, you can recover from danger, but you can't unpick your conscience. Can't undo the knowledge that you had a chance to help and you chose not to. That kind of wound, Noah, that's the kind that never closes. He put his hand on Noah's shoulder. Your daddy struggled with that. Struggled with things he'd done and things he'd failed to do. The guilt ate at him worse than any enemy bullet. He couldn't live with it in the end. But Noah, you don't have to carry that weight because you're doing it right. You're standing when it counts. And yeah, sometimes that means danger finds you. But you know what else it means? What? It means you can look yourself in the mirror and like what you see. Means you can sleep at night without the ghosts. Means that when you're my age, you'll have a list of people you helped instead of people you failed. And that list, kid, that's worth every scar you collect along the way. Noah leaned against Mason's side and Mason's arm came around him, and for a moment they just sat there. 8-year-old kid and 40-something biker. Two people who shouldn't have anything in common, but who'd found connection in the strange arithmetic of courage and consequence. I miss my dad, Noah whispered. I know, and that's okay. Missing people means they mattered, means they left a mark. Your daddy left a good mark on you, Noah. Don't let the end erase all the beginning and middle. They sat until the coffee was ready, until Iris called them inside. Until the moment passed and life had to continue, because that's what life did. It continued even when you wanted to pause, even when you needed time to process, even when you felt like the weight of being 8 years old and responsible was too much to carry. The bikers left the next day, not all at once, but in the same staggered way they'd departed months before. Each one stopped by to say goodbye. Each one ruffled Noah's hair or shook his hand or told him to stay brave. Bear gave Noah a small metal skull, a zipper pull from his own vest, worn smooth by decades of touch. You keep this, Bear said, and remember that being scared and being a coward aren't the same thing. Scared is smart. Coward is choice. You're scared sometimes, I can see it. But you've never been a coward. Don't start now. Mason was the last to leave the same way he'd been before. But this time before he mounted his bike, he pulled out a phone. Not a fancy smartphone. An old flip phone, simple and sturdy. This is yours, he said, handing it to Noah. My number's programmed. Only my number. You get scared, you call. You get threatened, you call. You just want to talk, you call. I don't care if it's 3 in the morning or the middle of a ride. You call, I answer. Why? Noah asked. Why do you care so much? Mason crouched down eye level again, and his expression was raw in a way Noah had never seen. Because I couldn't save your daddy. Couldn't pull him back from the edge, even though I tried. But I can be here for you. Can make sure you don't have to carry your burdens alone the way he did. That's my debt. That's my purpose. You gave me a second chance at getting this right. He stood, mounted his bike. The engine rumbled to life with that deep, satisfying growl that Noah would always associate with safety, now with protection, with people who kept their promises. You're gonna be okay, Noah Briggs, Mason called over the engine noise. More than okay. You're gonna be extraordinary. Then he was gone, riding into a future that would bring him back to Pine Ridge exactly 3 more times over the next 10 years. Once for Noah's middle school graduation, once for the dedication of the Jake Briggs Memorial Playground, and once a decade later when a 20-year-old Noah called that number and said he wanted to learn to ride. But in the moment watching that motorcycle disappear down Willow Creek Road, Noah felt something shift. Felt the burden of the last months begin to lighten. Not disappear because trauma didn't work that way, but become manageable. Become part of his story instead of the defining chapter. He went inside, helped his grandmother with dishes, did his homework, played with copper, did all the normal things that normal 8-year-olds did, except he wasn't normal and hadn't been since the moment he'd walked toward a chained woman instead of away. That night before bed, Noah opened the small box where he kept important things. His father's dog tags, the skull zipper pull from Bear, patches from 24 Hell's Angels chapters, a photo of him and Mason that someone had snapped during those first crazy days, and the flip phone charged and ready, a lifeline to people who'd proven that family wasn't always about blood. He touched each item like a talisman, like proof that he'd survived something impossible, like evidence that the world, for all its darkness, still had light in unexpected places. His grandmother appeared in the doorway. "You okay, baby?" Noah looked at her, this woman who'd raised him through grief and danger, who'd stood firm when the world got scary, who loved him fierce enough to let him be brave even when brave meant risk. "Yeah," he said and meant it. "I'm okay." She kissed his forehead, turned out the light, left the door cracked the way he liked it. And Noah Briggs, 8-year-old survivor of trauma and carrier of legacy, closed his eyes and slept without nightmares for the first time in months. Slept knowing that somewhere out there 3,000 people remembered his name. That courage wasn't about not being afraid, it was about acting despite fear. That his father's story didn't have to be his story, that mental illness was a battle some people lost, but that losing didn't erase all the wins that came before. Slept knowing he'd made a choice in the woods that day, and that choice had rippled outward in ways he couldn't have predicted, touching lives and changing minds, and proving that one small act of kindness could be the stone that starts in an avalanche. The next morning, Noah woke to sun streaming through his window and his grandmother's voice calling him down to breakfast. He put on his honorary vest over his t-shirt, not because he had anywhere special to go, just because it fit better now. Not physically, it was still too big, but in every other way that mattered, it fit exactly right. At school, Tucker was waiting by the bike racks. "You want to play basketball at recess?" "Yeah," Noah said. "That sounds good." And it was good, simple and uncomplicated, and exactly what 8-year-olds were supposed to do. The watching stranger was gone. The immediate danger was over. Life would throw other challenges at Noah because that's what life did, but he'd face them with the knowledge that he'd already survived the impossible. In Memphis, Savannah Cole sat at her kitchen table, wrists healed but scarred, and wrote a letter that she'd rewrite a dozen times before she got it right. A letter to Noah thanking him, telling him that she thought about him every day, that his courage had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with Mason in the first place, why she'd chosen this life despite its dangers. She'd mail it eventually. And Noah would keep it in his box of important things, would read it when he needed reminding that his choices mattered, that he'd made a difference, that the scared 8-year-old who gave water to a stranger had changed the world in ways both large and small. Years would pass, Noah would grow, would face challenges that made the events of that summer look simple in hindsight, would learn that courage wasn't a destination, but a practice, something you chose every day in 1,000 small ways, would struggle and succeed and fail and try again, would become eventually the kind of man his father had been before the war, the kind of man Mason tried to be despite his rough edges, the kind of man who stepped forward when others stepped back. But all of that was future. All of that was yet to come. In the present, in this moment, Noah was just a kid, playing basketball with a friend, wearing a vest too big for his shoulders, but exactly right for his heart, carrying scars he didn't regret and memories he'd treasure, living proof that sometimes the smallest people made the biggest difference, living proof that courage was contagious, living proof that one good choice could echo through time, touching lives in ways the original chooser never expected. Pine Ridge settled back into its rhythm. The news crews moved on to other stories. The viral videos became old news. But the town itself had changed. The people who'd been terrified of bikers now waved when they saw motorcycles pass through. The elementary school taught units on not judging by appearances. Mrs. Dillard kept that reserved table, and every few months a biker or two would stop in, would eat and tip well, and leave without fanfare, a quiet maintenance of connection. The money-funded programs that changed lives. The playground gave kids a safe place to be kids. The scholarships sent bright students to colleges they couldn't have afforded. Jake Briggs's name became associated not with how he died, but with what he'd raised with the son who'd inherited his courage without inheriting his demons. And somewhere on highways across 3 states, on back roads, in interstates, in garages and clubhouses, 3,000 bikers carried a story, told it to prospects and new members, told it to their kids and grandkids, told it to anyone who asked why they rode, why they wore the patches, why they lived by codes that seemed antiquated in the modern world. They told the story of an 8-year-old kid who didn't run, who gave water to a stranger, who held someone's hand while fear screamed at him to let go, who reminded them what they'd sworn to be. They told it because it was true, because it mattered, because in a world that seemed increasingly dark, increasingly divided, increasingly hostile, Noah Briggs had been a light, and light once kindled doesn't easily extinguish. It grows, it spreads, it endures. The memorial plaque at the fairgrounds was dedicated on a spring day when the dogwoods were blooming and the air smelled like possibilities. The whole town turned out. The mayor gave a speech. Sheriff Hall said a few words. And Noah, now 9 years old and a little taller, read the inscription aloud for the assembled crowd. To all who stand when others run, to courage in unexpected places, to the proof that fear and kindness can coexist and kindness can win. In memory of Jake Briggs and in honor of all who protect the innocent, we remember, we thank, we aspire. Simple words, but they meant something, captured something, preserved something that might otherwise have been lost to the slipstream of busy lives and short memories. After the ceremony, after the photos and handshakes and cake in the town hall, Noah walked to the edge of the fairgrounds, stood where he'd stood that day when the shooting started, felt the ghost of Savannah's arms around him protecting, felt the echo of fear that had threatened to swallow him whole, felt the resolution that had pulled him through. His grandmother found him there, didn't say anything, just stood beside him, her hand finding his. "You ever regret it?" she asked finally, helping her and all that came after. Noah thought about it, really thought, about the fear and the danger and the man who'd tried to kidnap him, about the nights he'd woken up shaking, about the weight of being marked as special when all he'd wanted was to be normal. "No," he said, "I don't regret it, I'd do it again." "Why, Mom?" "Because she needed help, and I could give it, that's enough reason." Iris squeezed his hand. "Your daddy would be so proud of you." "I hope so." "I know so, because you're who he wanted to be. You're his best parts carried forward." "That's not a burden, baby. That's a gift." They stood together as the sun tracked across the sky, stood as the crowd dispersed and life returned to normal, stood as another day in Pine Ridge, Tennessee, wound down toward dusk, toward dinner, toward all the small rituals that made up a life. And when they finally turned to leave, when Iris's hand guided Noah toward home and safety, and all the ordinary magic of being young and loved and alive, Noah looked back once, at the plaque, at the fairgrounds, at the place where everything had changed. He thought he saw movement in the distance, the glint of chrome, the sound of an engine. Mason may be keeping watch in the way he'd promised, or maybe just a trick of light, a wish disguised as reality. Either way, Noah smiled, turned his back on the past, and walked toward the future. A future that would be challenging and beautiful and terrifying and extraordinary. A future he had faced the same way he had faced everything else, with courage before fear, with kindness as his weapon, with the absolute certainty that standing when others run wasn't just the right choice. It was the only choice worth making.